I was known before I ever opened my mouth. When someone said, Pastor Halstead's daughter, it wasn't my name that came first. It was an image, an ideal, a mold carefully crafted over the years, polished by others' gazes, and maintained with meticulous discipline. I grew up as a reflection of what was expected of me. Straight posture, gentle smiles, unquestionable faith, noiseless obedience. Everyone saw me, everyone admired me, but no one knew me. Because what lived inside, I kept hidden like a flower in a dark room, alive, but wilting in silence. I always knew there was something in me that went beyond the church's boundaries, that didn't fit in the verses recited on Sundays, or in the modest dresses my mother hung on the wardrobe door with the care of someone preparing an altar. But I stayed quiet, out of respect, out of fear, out of loyalty to a name that wasn't just mine, but belonged to an entire community, until the day I saw him. He appeared like a glitch in the system, a tall, lean man with his hair tied back, carelessly paint stains on his collar, and a gaze that seemed to carry an entire story behind his irises. It was as if he didn't just look, he saw. As if his eyes could trespass without asking permission, but with a gentleness that made it feel like forgiveness rather than intrusion. I first saw him at the market, examining apples with an almost artistic care, as if searching not just for flavor, but for form. And for some reason, I still can't explain, he looked at me as if he already knew me. Not in a superficial way, not as the pastor's daughter, but as someone who recognizes a trapped soul even from a distance. I looked back, without smiling, without looking away. It was just a second, but in that second I knew someone had seen me, not as I presented myself, but as I was. And that simple realization made my heart take a step my legs weren't yet ready to follow. Because being truly seen, after a lifetime of hiding, is as terrifying as it is liberating. And in that moment, I knew the story of the woman I pretended to be was about to unravel before my own eyes. From that day on, his name began to echo inside me like a silent prayer. I thought of Samuel while arranging flowers for the altar, while preparing lessons for the Sunday school children, while sitting down to dinner with my father and pretending nothing in me was changing. And yet, everything was. I felt more restless, more aware, more alive. I began to notice the hues of the sky, the way the breeze moved the leaves in the late afternoon, how my own body reacted to the mere sound of a man's footsteps in the distance, hoping they were his. And it scared me, not out of shame, but out of awareness. For the first time, I knew what it was to want not just to be good, but to be true. And truth, I was beginning to understand, wasn't always gentle or comfortable. Samuel started finding me more often, or maybe I was where he was, without admitting it was on purpose. A few words exchanged here and there, brief as the flicker of a lit match. But there was something in his gaze, a care, a restraint, as if he were fighting, something within himself, trying to protect me, perhaps even himself. I wanted to ask more, to know more, but there were invisible boundaries between us. Boundaries born of my upbringing, my image in the community, and above all, the judgment that loomed over anything that strayed from the expected. The pastor's daughter wasn't supposed to be interested in a man like him, but the more I tried to extinguish that flame, the stronger it grew in silence. My father noticed. He's an observant man, though discreet. He began making subtle comments during our dinners, questions about who I was with, who accompanied me on visits, where I was spending so much time after services. Nothing overt, but enough to make me realize my freedom was being closely watched. And that's when something broke inside me, because I realized the world built around me was smaller than I was, It was beautiful, yes. It was solid, but it was narrow, and for the first time, I wanted more. It was on a Sunday morning, as everyone dispersed after the service, that it happened. I was leaving through the side of the church, trying to avoid excessive greetings, when I saw him leaning against the fence across the street. He was there, standing, as if waiting for something he couldn't even explain. Our eyes met, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I walked to him, my heart racing so fast I could barely feel my feet touching the ground. And without saying a word, I asked with my eyes, "Are you still there?" And he, in a low voice, almost a whisper, answered, "I'm not going anywhere." That was all. And in that moment, I knew what was growing between us wasn't a mistake. It was inevitable. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that moment had been just that, a moment, a lapse in my attention, a trap woven by the monotony of my routine, which sometimes made me dream of things that shouldn't exist. But something in me had already been touched. Even if I didn't know how to name it, I began to notice more of what I'd previously overlooked. The shades of the sunset as I walked home from church, the sound of rain on the porch, the way my heart quickened when I turned the corner in town, as if anticipating something my reason denied. And there he was, now and then, always alone, carrying a sketchbook and the look of someone who belonged more to the world he imagined than the real one. People whispered about him. They said he was strange, that he painted portraits of women with closed eyes, that he lived surrounded by canvases and never went to church. For me, that should have been a warning, but instead, it made me even more curious. One afternoon, as I left the grocer with a bag of ripe peaches, I found him standing in front of the flower shop, sketching a young woman with red hair sitting under the shade of a tree. She wasn't there. It was pure imagination. And yet, he drew her with the precision of someone who knew her deeply. I stood there, a few seconds longer than I should have, watching the firmness of his strokes, the care with details, and then, as if he'd known I was there all along, he looked up and said my name. My name. Not the pastor's daughter, not a polite title. Joanna. The sound came direct, calm, as if it were natural for him to know, as if my name had been with him all along. I froze. The world around me shrank. And when I finally managed to ask how he knew who I was, he answered with a simplicity that disarmed me completely. Because you have the face of someone who hasn't been painted yet. That's how it began. Not with a confession, nor a touch. It began with a silent invitation to enter a world I'd never been allowed to explore. And that night, as I closed my eyes, I felt a restlessness that wasn't sin, nor guilt. It was a desire for truth, a desire that grew like a whisper in my chest, saying that perhaps, just perhaps, there was another kind of salvation, the one that begins when we finally allow ourselves to be seen. And I wanted to be seen by him. Even without knowing the cost, in the days that followed, he began to appear where I hadn't noticed him before. Or perhaps I was, for the first time, open-eyed enough to see. The town library, the bench, in the square where I read after pastoral visits with my father, the path between the market and my mother's clinic. He never approached too closely. He just appeared, with the calm of someone who doesn't invade, but remains present. And with each of these silent appearances, something inside me churned with a mix of fear and fascination. It was as if the world I knew was slowly losing focus, and he, with his paint-stained sketchbooks, was redrawing everything around me. And the most terrifying, or perhaps the most liberating, thing was realizing I wanted to be included in that new outline. The first time we truly spoke was on a muggy late afternoon as I returned from the seamstress with a navy blue dress folded over my arm. He was sitting on the steps of the old train station, a brush between his fingers and a blank canvas before him. As I passed, I hesitated. Something about that empty canvas pulled me like an invisible current, and without fully understanding why, I stopped. He looked at me as if he'd known I would, not with arrogance, but with the serenity of someone who simply waits. "I'd like to paint you," he said. The words landed with the weight of a revelation. I stood still. Never in my life had a man looked at me with such clarity and such absence of malice. It wasn't crude desire. It was something deeper, a wish to immortalize what was inside, not just the appearance. I felt a strange warmth rise through my body, as if my convictions were being challenged by a truth I hadn't yet dared to face. My voice came out softer than usual. "Why?" He answered with a lightness that nearly brought me to tears. "Because there's something in your silence that screams louder than any words." I left without accepting or refusing. But that night, as I brushed my hair in front of the mirror, I asked myself who I was when no one was watching. And if perhaps, just perhaps, this man, who didn't even attend services, who lived on the margins of everything my father preached, had seen me more deeply than all those who claimed to know me since childhood. For the first time, the reflection in the mirror seemed incomplete, and I knew. The choice was before me, not just about being painted, but about being revealed. I went back. 2 weeks after that invitation, I hadn't accepted out loud, but never truly refused. I walked to his studio like someone carrying a sweet guilt, the kind that doesn't seek forgiveness. The windows were open, and the smell of paint mixed with old wood hit me before I even knocked. He was inside, his back to me, as if he knew I'd come. He didn't turn right away. He kept mixing colors with the tip of his brush, as if time had lost all urgency. And then he said, "My name, low, serene, with the tone of someone invoking, not calling." I stepped in without a word. My footsteps on the old floorboards sounded too loud for what I carried inside, a whirlwind of silence and courage. He pointed to a chair in front of the blank canvas, and I sat, without hiding, without retreating. And in that gesture I began to shed everything the world had placed on me. In the first sessions he barely spoke. He just painted. Sometimes he'd watch me for long seconds, without touching the canvas, as if searching for something not on the surface. At first I felt exposed, as if every inch of my face revealed secrets I didn't even know. But over time, that gaze stopped wounding me. He wasn't devouring me. He was listening, with his eyes, with his silence, with the patience of someone who knows nothing true can be rushed. I started to talk, at first about simple things, the flowers my mother grew, the books I hid under my bed, the times I caught myself crying alone without knowing why. He listened to everything like someone guarding confidences. He never interrupted, never judged, just absorbed, and with each pause, each shared glance, I saw myself stripped of labels. I was no longer the pastor's daughter, no longer the model of behavior. I was just me, and for the first time, that was enough. One afternoon, after finishing a session, he offered me a glass of lemonade and showed me an early version of the portrait. It wasn't final, but it was real. And when I looked at that canvas, I felt a jolt that took my breath away. He hadn't painted just my face. He'd painted my conflict, my hunger, my loneliness disguised as composure. It was as if each brush stroke said, "I see you." And that moved me more than any sermon I'd ever heard. I lightly touched the edge of the canvas, too afraid to meet his eyes, and in that moment, I knew something in me would never go back to what it was. The woman he'd painted was the woman I wanted to be outside of there, even if the world wasn't ready, even if I didn't yet know how. The change was slow, almost imperceptible but inevitable, like morning light creeping into a house through forgotten cracks. With each day, I returned to the studio, A layer of me stayed behind, an old obedience, a learned gesture, a guilt that wasn't mine. And the most frightening thing was that no one seemed to notice. My parents still greeted me with the same calm smiles. The church members still treated me as an example. And I carried on with my impeccable posture, my modest dress, my gentle voice. But inside, a rebirth was taking shape. I was discovering life with virgin eyes. And it all began with that gaze, his, that didn't demand explanations or confessions, just presence. He kept painting. The canvas had become a cruel and beautiful mirror. It didn't flatter me, but revealed me. I saw the intensity ink, the restlessness contained in the corners of my mouth, the strength suppressed in my upright neck. It wasn't a painting meant to please. It was meant to expose. And as much as that scared me, it also freed me. I began writing at night, in secret. Loose pages, letters without a recipient. I wrote everything I didn't have the courage to say aloud, the impure thoughts, the guarded desires, the dreams interrupted for the sake of a faith that was never truly mine. And in those writings, I saw myself blooming, even if still in the shadows. It was also during this time that our smiles began to linger longer than necessary, that our silences began to fill with a gentle, almost poetic tension, that our fingers brushed against the edge of a canvas and stayed there a second too long. There was never haste, never promises, but there was a pulsing connection built on everything subtle and true. One day he asked what I feared most. The question came, without warning, in the middle of a muggy afternoon, as he cleaned his brush with a cloth-stained green. I stayed silent for too long. And then, without meeting his eyes, I answered, being forgotten, being remembered only as the pastor's daughter. He didn't say anything. He just resumed painting with a faint glimmer in his eyes, as if that answer was the final piece of a puzzle he'd been assembling since the first day. But the world outside was painting its own pictures, and not all with soft colors. The rumors began with whispers at the church door. She's been spending too much time away from home. They say she was seen going into the studio. It's not proper for a well-bred girl. Short, sharp words spat by tongues that never knew what it meant to live hungry for freedom. My mother called me for a talk. My father began watching me with less gentle eyes, and that's when I realized the veil protecting me was starting to tear. The town, as small in geography as it was in mentality, no longer saw me with the same reverence, and I knew the portrait was nearly done. And with it would come the moment when everything hidden could no longer fit in silence. The revelation didn't come with scandal. It came with the inevitability of days that dawn, even when we wish to prolong the night. The portrait was finished in silence, without warning, without announcement. When I arrived at the studio that afternoon, it was covered with a heavy white cloth, as if the canvas itself knew the weight it carried. He looked at me with a new exhaustion in his eyes, not physical but emotional, as if he knew he'd given form to something that could no longer be contained. "It's done," he said simply, and my breath faltered for a moment. I walked to the canvas, my body tense and my heart out of rhythm, and when he lifted the cloth, I felt the world around me shrink to the space between me and that painting. There I was, but not the Joanna the world knew, not the pastor's daughter with straight posture, serene gaze, and submissive expression. The woman on the canvas was intense. Her eyes were slightly narrowed, as if hiding a newly discovered truth. Her mouth parted, as if about to speak something silenced for years. Her neck curved with elegance, but bearing a palpable tension. It was as if each brush stroke had captured not just my image, but my conflict, my hunger, my restrained courage, my soul. I looked at him wordless, and for the first time since it all began, I cried, not from sadness, but from recognition. I saw myself, and for the first time, I accepted that version of me. He approached slowly, as he always did, without invading, without imposing. He lightly brushed his hand over the back of my neck and whispered, "This is you, not what others see, what you are." I closed my eyes. I wanted to stay there, frozen in that moment when everything made sense, before the real world caught up with us. But it did, with its judging eyes, its rules, and its punishments. The next morning, the portrait was displayed in the window of the local gallery. A decision of his, bold, necessary, unthinkable. And within hours, the entire town knew. The comments were cutting, cruel. Some called it immoral, others provocation. Some said I'd been corrupted, that I was lost, that I shamed my family's name. My father didn't look at me during dinner. My mother cried softly in her room, and I sat at the table, hands steady in my lap, staring at the cold plate, unmoving. Because inside, something in me remained, whole. Because I'd already faced the most honest gaze I could, my own, and no one could take that away. The silence that night was louder than any Sunday sermon, but I faced it like someone no longer afraid of her own voice. That madrugada, I walked to the studio. He was awake, sitting on the floor, surrounded by unfinished canvases. When he saw me, he said nothing. He just made space between his legs and welcomed me there, in the midst of chaos, the only place I felt complete. And then I whispered, for the first time, "I don't want to hide who I am anymore." He embraced me, and in that embrace, I felt the end of an era. The rupture between the woman I was and the woman I now chose to be, even if it cost everything, because the portrait had been painted, and it didn't show sin, it showed freedom. The days that followed were an exercise in endurance. Doors that once opened with smiles now stayed half closed, with hard gazes and measured words. I kept walking the same streets, but I was no longer the same, and everyone seemed to feel it. Some looked away, others whispered names that didn't match what they knew of me. Rebel, wayward, shame. But something curious settled in me during that time, the absence of guilt. I, who for so long carried the faith of others like a cross, now walked lightly, because at last I'd found my truth, and it didn't need explaining or forgiving. The portrait was removed from the gallery window by the owner, pressured by congregants threatening to boycott the town's events. But it didn't matter. It had already served its purpose. It had revealed me. It had flung open a door I could never close again. My father at last called me to talk. His face, once full of convictions, now bore a conflict that moved me. He was a man torn between the pastor guiding a congregation and the father watching, his daughter transform before his eyes. He said I was tarnishing the family's legacy, that my conduct didn't align with the image he'd built over decades. I listened in silence, for the first time, without fear. And when he finished, I simply said, "For the first time, Father, this image is mine, not yours, not the church's, mine." He didn't respond, but he didn't stop me from leaving either. I returned to the studio at dusk. The sky was rust-colored, and the world seemed suspended in a pause between before and after. I found Samuel preparing new canvases. He looked at me like he knew I'd crossed the line, and still he welcomed me with the tenderness of someone who understands the cost of becoming oneself. We didn't talk about religion, family, or ruined reputations. We talked about the future, a future without guarantees, but with space. A future where I could write, paint, exist, where he could love me not as the image of an idealized woman, but as the woman who chose to be free. In time, we left the town, not in flight, but in search of a fresh start. We went to a place where no one knew my last name, where I was no one's daughter but my own. There I began to paint too, not with Samuel's technical precision, but with the urgency of someone with much to say who'd finally found the right colors. Our days were made of creative silence, lingering touches, simple meals, books piled on the floor. And on the walls of our home, we hung our works, his full of form and light, mine full of emotion and shadow. But in all of them, there was a common thread: freedom. Today, I look back with love, not nostalgia for the prison, but gratitude for the courage I had to leave it. The portrait still exists. It hangs in the living room in the frame he carved himself. Sometimes I stand before it and recognize myself. The expression remains the same: narrowed eyes, parted mouth, tense neck. But now, when I look, I no longer see conflict. I see strength. I see a woman who walked through the fire of judgment and came out the other side more alive, more whole, more her own. Because loving in the end isn't about fitting into anyone's frame. It's about having the courage to be your own work of art, even if it scandalizes the whole world. Years have passed, and there are still days when I sit by the window and remember the girl I was, silent, molded, obedient. And I smile with tenderness, not disdain, but gratitude, because I had to be her to become this. Today, the faith I carry isn't the one I was taught to recite, but the one I learned to feel, a faith in myself, in what burns in my chest when we're true to our own soul. Samuel and I have aged among canvases, paints, and comfortable silences. We never wanted applause, just truth. And that together we cultivate every day. The love that began with a portrait was never confined to an image. It became a path, a refuge, freedom,